Hey, I'm Beth, and I was born here in Preston. I love history and learning about the people who lived here in the past. One woman I think deserves a bit more recognition is Edith Rigby. She was born in the Victorian era, and she cared about the working class rights and women's rights of Preston. She was someone who pushed social boundaries, who was a proud suffragette, and apparently the first woman in Preston to ride a bike. In true Edith style, I'm going to take you on a bicycle tour around her life, to all the places which made her the most controversial, but in my opinion, the coolest woman in Preston's past. Let's go. Edith was born in 1872. Preston at that time was a thriving industrial town, filled with cotton mills and huge factories. During the 1800s, Lancashire alone was producing half of the world's cotton. But this meant that Preston was smoggy with pollution and overcrowded with thousands of low-paid working-class people. This is Pole Street, which is where Edith was brought up. She lived in this 3-storey building with her mum, her dad and her 6 siblings. This also acted as her dad's doctor's surgery. But at the time, this was a really deprived area, so all of his patients would have been really poor. This meant that Edith, growing up, would have seen the struggles day in and day out of the working class community. Edith's niece, Phoebe Hesketh, wrote this book called My Aunt Edith. You can get it from the Harris Library if you want to read it yourself. And it tells loads of amazing tales about her aunt's life. This one is set on Christmas morning when Edith was 12. She went out to Church Street with a basket full of gifts and handed them out to the mill workers as they were passing on the way to church that morning. That would have been completely out of the social norm, but Edith was extraordinary from an early age. She recognised the injustice of the class system and was already trying to change it. Edith went to school here, at number 5 Winkley Square. Dr. Rayner made sure all his children had a good education. And like most children, Edith would have learned how to read and write, but she also had the privilege of doing sports, playing an instrument and learning French. Many poor children in Preston only went to school until they were 13. Then they had to start working full-time in the mill. Edith, however, transferred to boarding school in Wales, where she stayed until she was 18 years old. Unlike her brothers, Edith didn't go to university. We don't know why exactly, but we know in 1890 only a handful of universities actually accepted women.
It was a time when girls didn't expect, or parents didn't expect their daughters to go on to university. Even if they did, they probably wouldn't be able to qualify and get a degree because many of the universities didn't recognise women students.
Women were supposed to be supportive wives, loving mothers, and brilliant hostesses of the house. There was no reason for them to form a political opinion or to pursue a career. Women were just a small part of a man's world. But Edith wasn't keen on conforming to that idea. Legend has it that a teenage Edith was the first woman in Preston to ride a bike. It would have been incredibly difficult to wear a long, heavy skirt and ride, so she wore loose pants called bloomers. And with her new bicycle, she could travel, explore, and finally have the same freedom that men had had for centuries. Phoebe describes how her aunt was pelted with vegetables and eggs as she rode through Preston's parks, but that didn't stop her. Edith rode as far as Leicester, 150 miles away, to visit a friend. She was fearless, bold, and much better than I am at riding a bike. When Edith was 20, she married Dr. Charles Rigby here at the Methodist Church, which still stands on Lea Street today. I managed to find an old newspaper report from the Preston Herald, which gives a detailed account of the wedding. Apparently she looked very pretty in her bridal costume, and it was a packed out church. And what I find funny is the reporter says that she arrived exactly on 12 o'clock. It seems like Edith couldn't be a traditionalist, even on a wedding day. The bride's meant to arrive late, but not Edith Rigby. In 1893, the pair moved here, to Winkley Square. This was the most affluent part of the city centre. Barristers, lawyers and mill owners lived in these houses, and the greenness of the park was a huge contrast to the drab brick street Edith grew up on. Edith's new neighbours weren't fans of her unconventional ways. Edith did have servants, but she didn't make them wear uniforms like the rest of the square, and she let them eat at the dining table with her and Charles. Much to the horror of the residents, Edith scrubbed her own front steps. And in 1905, her and Charles adopted a little boy called Arthur. But Edith wasn't going to be a stay-at-home mum. There was work to be done and lives to change. She started by setting up the Old St. Peter's School in Brook Street. Girls who attended the club would start work in the mills at 6 a.m. and not leave till 5:30. That's almost a 12-hour day. Back then, they would have worked on a Saturday too. They'd pay a tuppence, which was about 65p in today's money, and they could come along to the club twice a week. Edith wanted to keep them learning, but also give them a chance to relax after a stressful day at work. So she'd take them swimming, to the park to play cricket, and to watch theatre shows. She also took it upon herself to sort out the working standards of the mills and factories of Preston. She would stand outside the buildings, asking workers how they were treated. She then took all the information to the bosses and fought for better conditions for them. This is Wood's Tobacco Manufacturers in Avon Street. Edith managed to have more windows to bring in natural daylight and better ventilation installed into the building. For a woman of the time, it was a huge demand and an even bigger achievement. Though Edith was making local change, there was still a global problem to fix. Shockingly, women didn't have the right to vote. One lady who disagreed with this was a Mancunian called Emmeline Pankhurst. In 1903, she set up the Women's Social and Political Union, commonly known as the Suffragettes.
And they said, right, we must do more to get the vote than just ask politely. We will have a campaign. We will set about, we will attend all political meetings, and we will demand to have our voices heard. And again, still the voices weren't heard. Therefore, they found as the years went on, they had to take even more drastic action to try and get the attention of the people of the country so that women could have the vote, because they felt if women had the vote, then they would be able to pass the laws that would help and improve the conditions for all women and young girls as well.
The phrase, "deeds not words," was a suffragette slogan. After years of obedience, years of oppression, women up and down the country banded together to rise up and demand that they should be taken seriously. In 1905, after meeting Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Edith decided she was going to join the movement. Edith set up the Preston branch of the WSPU and held meetings here at 28 Winkley Square. To identify as a suffragette was scandalous in society. Suffragettes were rule breakers. To get publicity, they'd smash shop windows, chain themselves to railings, and set fire to government buildings. Edith was an avid participator. She was arrested 7 times for her acts of militancy. In 1907, Edith and a group of Preston suffragettes travelled to London by train. They were arrested outside of Buckingham Palace for acts of protest. Edith was sent to Holloway Prison, where she spent time inside. And on her release, she would have received a brooch like this from the WSPU. It would have been gifted to Edith for her acts of service to the suffrage cause. And you can actually see it in the Harris Museum if you come and visit. Suffragettes gained a great deal of publicity by going to prison, so they'd never pay to get bail. They had interviews with reporters when they got out, so this meant that day after day their campaign will be in the headlines.
Prison is a grimy, serious institution, a new experience for many of us who have never experienced cold or hunger. It's good for us all to experience conditions which are beyond many people's social horizon.
The suffragettes put their lives in danger whilst in prison by performing in group hunger strikes. Now the government couldn't let the women die, so began to force feed them. Edith, being a committed suffragette, endured force feeding and the horrors it brought.
He put down my throat a tube which seemed to me much too wide. I choked the moment it touched my throat until it had got down, and then the food was poured in quickly. It made me sick a few seconds after it was down, and the action of the sickness made my body and legs double up. But the wardresses instantly pressed back my head, and the doctor leant on my knees. The horror of it was more than I can describe.
In 1912, future Prime Minister Winston Churchill was to give a speech here at the public hall, although Edith and the suffragettes had an idea to stick posters all over the city. On the walls of the public hall, the prison, post offices and pillar boxes of graphic force-feeding pictures. It caused uproar in Preston. It was a year later, in 1913, when Edith shocked not just the town, but the nation. In the space of 3 days, she planted a bomb in the Liverpool Cotton Exchange and set fire to Lord Levenshulme's vacant cottage in Rivington. She admitted to both of the crimes.
I placed that explosive in the Liverpool Exchange, and I wanted you to realise that when women are driven to these desperate measures, how comparatively easy it is for them to get explosives and place them in public buildings.
The suffragettes believed that the government cared more about their properties than the women of the country. And in Lord Levenshulme's case, £20,000 worth of damage. That's equivalent to over £1 million in today's currency. It is debated whether Edith's actions were daring and carefully thought out, or just dangerous and a stroke of pure luck that no one got hurt. Another outrageous tale is when the police came to rearrest Edith from Winkley Square. However, Edith had other plans. She managed to sneak out of the back, dress as a workman, and escape to Ireland to avoid capture. Although most of her damage has been destroyed, Edith and the WSPU have still left their mark of defiance in Miller Park. This is the Lord Darby statue. Lord Darby's son didn't believe that women should have a vote. One morning, his statue was discovered covered in tar. The main suspect was Edith Rigby, although she says it wasn't her, though we do think she could have been the brains behind the mission. If you look close enough, you can still see some stains left there today. It's fair to acknowledge that not all men in the 1910s were against women having the vote. Many supported them, including Dr. Charles Rigby.
I do not have the moral courage to face what she has done. I doubt I could do it for any cause. But I'm perfectly and absolutely sure that she is right. And I believe before the year is out, the vote will be won. Yours faithfully, Charles Rigby.
In 1914, the First World War began. This saw over 6 million men going off to fight in mainland Europe. Women had to step up to fill some of the work roles they'd never imagined being able to do. Edith and the WSPU did their bit too. Edith and Charles came here to Marigold Cottage in Penwitham. It was a place where Edith could farm and help the war effort. She sold the produce at Preston Market, which is still there today. Whilst living in Penwitham, Edith was responsible for setting up the first Women's Institute Society in Lancashire. The Hutton and Howick WI still celebrate their founding member today. After the war in 1918, the world grieved the loss of millions of men. It was a chance for the British government to reflect. With the combination of the women's war efforts over the past 4 years and the Parliament not wanting any more violence in the country, they decided it was time to give some women the right to vote. To have the right to vote, women had to be over 30 and then either own their own property, be married to someone who did own property, or be a graduate. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And in 1928, just 10 years later, the government decided to give all women over the age of 21 the vote. Edith Rigby died in Wales in 1950. She loved the Welsh coast and was happy to spend the end of her life there. I can't help but wonder, while doing this tour, how many lives Edith actually changed for the better. How much we have to thank her for. Do you know, we don't have a single female statue in Preston. I'd like to one day maybe borrow some of Edith's assertiveness and change that. I'd love to see a statue of Edith put up in Winkley Square, of her famously riding her bike. That way when anyone goes past, they'll remember that just over 100 years ago, women weren't even allowed to ride bikes, let alone study or have a right to vote. But if you have an ambition, can imagine the destination clear enough in your mind, and aren't afraid of the obstacles that'll try and block your way, you'll get there, and it'll all be worth it.